Now in this lecture we are going to go back to our previous example where we have this mock repository that return some employees, and I will refactor this a bit in order to make it asynchronous. So let's assume that the repository makes a HTTP call to a server and return a promise. That's a very realistic example. So here I will go directly and mock this. So I will assume that I have a promise resolve that returns this array here. So this pretty much is equivalent to mocking HTTP fetch that returns a JSON result. And at the end of the promise result, now we have the first or none, which at this point it's not valid. But what we can do, we can use the then in order to map, right? So if I go here and use then, that the then is equivalent to a map for the promise, we can access the employees, and now for the employees we can go and write employees first or none. Okay, so this will return after the then there will be a promise that contains maybe employee, and we want to further simplify that. Now if I also move this here, then we have an either inside the promise. Said that the promise is like an either asynchronous, so we have an either inside an either. The then of the promise, it's way overloaded by design, and also if you have a promise, if this lambda inside the then returns a promise, then the designer figure out that they just have to combine the promises and return just a single promise. We'll see later that this called monadic bind, or it's called bind, and this makes the promise a monad. But what we're going to do, so if we manage to create a toEther async that instead of an either returns a promise, with this then it will have a promise that the then inside returns a promise, and they will be combined properly into a single promise. So we can use the then in order to flatten a promise into a promise if we change this into returning a promise instead of an either. So I'll just rename that into toEther async. Now I have to implement this toEther async, and that's way easier to do because we have a maybe and we want to return a promise, because we already said that the promise looks like an either. So I can return a new promise. And we initialize the promise like that. So in case of we have the this matches to the maybe. In the case of the none, we initially return a left, and this is equivalent to rejecting the promise with this default left. In case where there was a value, then we can just resolve the promise with the value. So this effectively converts a maybe to a promise. So this could be called to promise. So this here now, it's this is a promise, and then pass inside the lambda that returns a promise. By design, the then flattens the promise into a promise. So we expect here the match with. For the match with, we'll copy the pattern match for our promise that we already created in the previous lecture, and here Now expect that there should be a promise, we'll pattern match on the promise using our extension, and we expect to reach one of those cases. So I'll add the breakpoint. Okay, so now if I run that, I expect to reach this case with the correct result. That's better and that's correct. And also if we just reject that, or maybe just go here and give a 3, for example, where it's faulty, then we end up in this case. So that was an example using just to actually realize that the promise, it's like an either, right? But here we have a promise inside the promise situation,